Hello, Dr. Tucci here again. In this session, we're going to be talking about a writing intervention for teachers. But before we get started, take a look at the learning objectives, write them down, refer to them throughout the session, and hopefully you'll be able to answer all of the questions by the end of this session. So let's get started. Strategic and interactive writing instruction, otherwise known as SIWI, will be the topic of today's session. So what is SIWI? SIWI was developed by Dr. Kimberly Wolbers at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and she really created this writing instruction intervention using the evidence base for hearing students, so both achieving writers and struggling writers, as well as English language learners. And she took that evidence-based and modified it with strategies that we know are responsive to deaf and hard of hearing children's specific language needs. The writing intervention helps teachers implement more effective writing instruction, and it looks at discourse level writing, grammar and complexity, expressive language abilities, and motivation. And studies up to this point describe SIWI as an effective practice for use with students who have mild to severe hearing losses and who use a variation of communication methodologies, so ASL, speech, English-based sign, and also those who are presenting severe delays in their primary language. So before we really talk about the intervention, let's talk about authentic writing. What is authentic writing? Well, writing that has a real purpose and real readers or real audience who read the completed product and engage with the writers, that's authentic writing. And children learn to write through authentic writing activities. So if we're not presenting real, meaningful writing experiences for our students, writing really becomes this very superficial academic task. So, writing is answering questions from a book. It's fixing their grammar with the teacher. It's writing a book report with mom at home. It's not something that's meaningful to them. And what they do is they lose the ultimate goal of writing, which is communicating with other people. So if we want our students to identify themselves as real authors, their writing must start with real reasons to write, and it must be shared with a real audience. So what are some authentic writing examples? Well, if you look at the genre of personal narrative, you could create a newsletter with your students, and they could share that newsletter with other students or staff in the school building. You could create an online class blog that could be shared with friends and family at home. You could have students write personal stories and share those with other classes in the school or even with pen pals. If we want to look at informative writing, students could create brochures for local stores. They could create public service announcements. So one of the examples Dr. Wolbers often gives is a class that wrote public service announcements for their local nature center. They could present illustrated books or PowerPoint presentations and share them with younger students in their school. For persuasive writing, they could create posters of school issues or civic issues. They could be posted in the hallway or shared with administrative staff or family members. And maybe creating advertisements. So your class is going to have a bake sale and they're preparing to pay for a field trip. So they create an advertisement for the bake sale and they put that up in the hallway. All of these things have real meaning behind them. They're writing for a real reason that is relevant to them. And they're also sharing this writing with a real audience, people that are going to give them feedback. They're going to talk to them about what the product is and how it related to them. Did they understand it? Did it make sense? Was it actually persuasive? And we need to be doing this when we're presenting writing to our children, not just a task about grammar. So how do you help your students to become authentic writers? Well, you need to provide activities that engage students in writing as authors. So real purpose, real audience. You also need to read the type of writing that you are expecting your students to produce. That way you can point out what the text structure is. You can point out the language usage, and you can help students differentiate between the types of writing they've already produced versus the new kind of writing that you're asking them to produce. You have to make time for writing instruction. You can't expect students to learn to write just by watching other people write. They have to engage in the process. They also can't learn to write just through reading alone. So again, it's engagement in the process, but engagement in a meaningful process where they have real purpose and they have a real audience. You have to keep your instructional approach balanced, so you're paying attention to writing, text structure, genre knowledge, the writing process itself, but you're also balancing that with language skills, so grammar, writing conventions, spelling, word choice. If you have too much drill and practice in grammar instruction, that really will come at the detriment of discourse level writing skills, and that's really where the meaning of writing comes from. So how do you motivate your students to write? Chances are your students have had some terrible experiences with writing, and students are very likely to experience failure with writing if they're asked to write independently and they don't have the skills to do so. So what you need to do is provide a sequence of writing that helps them to build their successes and build their confidence. And you do this through guided writing and shared writing that's accompanied by apprenticeship and coaching, because it's necessary to cultivate independent writing ability. You can't start with independent writing, you have to build up to that ability. Okay, so before we actually get into what guided writing and shared writing are, let's talk about the writing process. So we start with guided writing, and as students become more and more capable of directing their own writing, we move into shared writing. And as students become more and more comfortable with shared writing, we move into independent writing. And then when new types of language usage are presented, new genres, writing genres are presented, the independent writing then circles back around to guided writing, and you complete the cycle again. So the writing process is not really sequential, it's cyclical, and there's no hard beginning and hard end, depending on the language you're using, the genre you're using, the abilities of your students in terms of their expressive language, their vocabulary understanding. You might pop up somewhere within that cycle and then move from there. So I want to make sure that we understand that there's no step 1, step 2, step 3 to writing, and that's the way we do typically teach it. It really is more organic and holistic than that. And where your children are and where their ideas and their necessary supports come up within the writing process, that's really what drives you forward. So what is guided writing? Well, in guided writing, teachers and students co-construct a piece of writing where there's a gradual release of support and less scaffolding. So Dr. Wolbers often uses learning to ride a bike as an example. So you don't just put your child on a bicycle and tell them to go, right? First they start on a tricycle and they sort of learn how to pedal and they learn how to turn the handlebars, and when they get good enough with that, then you might introduce them to a bicycle with training wheels. And you might even still hold on to the back of the seat as they sort of figure out how to balance and move forward, and again they're pedaling, and as they kind of get the hang of that, then you might take the training wheels off. But you still don't have them just try to ride the bike without any training wheels. You're sort of holding on to the back of the seat, you're running along behind them, you're holding on to the handlebars, and you may let go for a minute and grab back on, and then let go for a minute and grab back on, and then when they finally sort of get the hang of it, then you let go and they fly. And so that's sort of what the writing process is like, and a lot of the times what we're doing is we're expecting to put a child right on that bicycle and have them move along. And what happens is they crash and they burn. And then that failure with writing really demotivates them, and they don't want to write anymore. For students to gain confidence, we need to move through guided writing. And as they experience those small successes through guided writing, building their confidence, we increase their motivation to write. We can't expect students to engage in independent writing too early, as this sets them up for potential failure. And one of the things people say is, well, what if we conference afterwards? Well, that's really too late to provide support, because what you're doing is you're providing support after the writing process is already over. So you've asked the child, go, do some writing, and all of the strategies that the child might need to be supported doing the writing, completing the writing process, you're not there for that. You're waiting until they're done and they're bringing you a product and you're saying, okay, now let's try to fix it. And that's too late. And they've experienced too much frustration, too much failure. And again, we're demotivating them. We're not allowing them to have enough success where they really want to write. Writing is a recursive process. It doesn't happen in lockstep. There's not a first draft, second draft, final draft sequence, and that's really the typical way we teach children how to write. And that's not how real writers write. They may read a mentor text or a model text and sort of figure out the text structure and the language. And then they plan a little bit and they brainstorm some ideas and they might return to the model text. And then after all of that, they sit down and take a first go at writing. And they write a little bit, and they read it, and they might share it with a colleague, and then they might put it away for a little bit and sort of, let it marinate. And then they go back to the writing, they write some more, they edit, they add, and it's this really messy, organic process. And that's the process we need to be teaching our students. Not that step 1, step 2, step 3, done. That's not writing, and that doesn't motivate children to write. And so we have to move away from that and look at the way real writers write and teach that process. So how do you initiate guided writing? Well, ask your students questions. What do we do here? What do you think about this? What kind of topic do you want to write about? What do you notice about this text that stands out to you? What's your opinion? Let the students drive the writing process. Don't assume to know what the students know. Give them the floor to guide the writing. When students are stuck within the writing process, that's when you or a peer should step in and offer support. So that's that more knowledgeable other strategy that we talked about in an earlier session. You need to model what you would do in that situation, and then you need to explain why you're doing that. The teacher or the peer should externalize their thinking so that the other students can know. So there's that visualization, there's that theory of mind. Let me make it obvious what's going on in my mind so that you have the ability to use that metacognitive strategy. And contributions should be made at the level just above what the students currently know independently. So there's that zone of proximal development. These things actually do work and they do matter. So once you've sort of gone through the guided writing portion of the writing process, you move into shared writing. And shared writing is slightly less supported than guided writing. Students typically write in small groups or pairs, and the teacher sort of floats around and offers support on and off as driven by student ideas, necessary edits, areas of weakness, language needs. You might want to use model or mentor text as support during shared writing. That way the student isn't always looking for the teacher to move them through a stuck point. If you can't find a model text that really fits with your student's zone of proximal development, you can create a model text yourself. Just make sure that you're really thinking about how to create a piece of authentic writing. So how do you identify target language and writing skills? Well, you can use informal assessments that come up during the writing process. You can use independent writing samples to sort of identify those areas of weakness that your students have. Also, consider students' written English abilities, their expressive language abilities, as well as their metalinguistic knowledge. Expressive language abilities really drive a student's ability to write. So if you establish a classroom environment where collaboration and communication happens, then you're supporting the development of expressive language. So through conversational exchanges, you provide opportunities for language growth that are necessary for writing growth. So in summary, let's talk about the major points that you should take away from strategic and interactive writing instruction. First, you must provide opportunities for authentic writing. Authentic writing is writing with a real purpose, a purpose that's relevant to your students, and writing that's shared with a real audience. So Have the students engage with the audience. Let the audience give them feedback so that they know if their product actually made a difference in their readers' lives, in their readers' knowledge of a topic. That's very important. Don't expect students to produce independent work too early. This can lead to failure and really demotivate our students in their willingness to take a chance at writing. Provide support throughout the writing process. Don't let go too quickly. Don't give them the bicycle without the training wheels too quickly. Start with guided writing, move through the guided writing process into the shared writing process, and if you have to move backwards, if you have to go from shared writing back to guided writing when you introduce a new piece of language or a new text structure, that's okay. The writing process is messy, and you should be as authentic as you can when you teach your children how to write. Remember that writing is a recursive process. It's not a step-by-step sequence. There's no hard beginning and there's no hard end. It's messy, and that's okay. Show your students what real authors, what real writers go through. If you do these things, I guarantee you your students will be more motivated to write, and they'll be writing better pieces of text. So this session concludes my lecture series, and I just thank you so much for joining me on this journey through all of these topics that we've discussed. Just a quick recap. We talked about the reading brain and how important that early communication with your child is, and that as a school teacher, it's really within your best interest and your children's best interest for you to be involved in the early intervention world. We talked about evidence-based practices, where to find them, and how to determine if something is or isn't an evidence-based practice. We also talked about what do you do if there isn't an evidence-based practice. We discussed several strategies that are evidence-based that you can use to modify a product that may or may not be evidence-based with your students. We talked about the difference between vocabulary or grammar and came to the decision that it's vocabulary and grammar. We talked about Foundations for Literacy, which looks at building early literacy skills with very young children. And finally, we talked about strategic writing instruction. So remember, no isolated words, provide authentic activities, think about phrasal language and phrasal reading, and I hope you're able to take this information and apply it to your classrooms. I wish you the best with all of your future journeys in this very important field, and I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.